Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for the History Valley podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Konrad Schmid. How are you doing, Doctor?
Very well. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And for those that don't know who he is, Konrad Schmid studied theology at the universities of Zurich, Greifswald, and Munich. After a vicariate, he worked as assistant and senior assistant at the Faculty of Theology of the University of Zurich between 1991 and 1999. From 1999 to 2002, he was associate professor of Old Testament at the Faculty of Theology of the Heidelberg University. In 2002, Konrad Schmid was appointed professor of the Hebrew Bible and Ancient Judaism at the Faculty of Theology of the University of Zurich. From 2008 to 2010, he also served as the dean of his faculty. He was a fellow of the Wissenschaftliche zu Berlin Institute of Advanced Study from 2020 to 2021. All right, so we got a PowerPoint presentation I'm going to be putting up right now, and that's his book that we're going to be covering today, Is There Theology in the Hebrew Bible? There's a couple of links right there on the right part of the slide to where you can go purchase his book. All right, let's get to the next slide and get started. So in chapter 2 on page 44, you talk about that von Rad's theology of the Old Testament. Only in the wake of von Rad's theology of the Old Testament does it become possible to understand how Rainer Alberts presents the view and is a history of Israelite religion in the Old Testament period. Could you talk about that and discuss what you mean by that and the implications of that?
Yes, I think it's crucial to see that the term and the project of the theology of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament actually came up within Christian theology. The term theology itself stems actually from Greek philosophy. So the earliest instances can be found in Plato and Aristotle. But then theology actually took on this idea in the medieval times of a doctrinal system. So theology is something that is a synthesis of the thoughts, for example, that are in the Bible. And this approach to theology and the theology of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, was dominant until the middle of the 20th century, when Gerhard von Rad published his seminal Theology of the Old Testament. It was a 2-volumes work, was published in 1957. The first volume, second volume in 1960. It also was translated into English. And von Rad made a very fundamental decision, and he said, theology of the Old Testament cannot be a system of the thoughts of the Hebrew Bible, because the Hebrew Bible cannot be systematized. It's too rich, it's too broad, it includes too many voices, and whoever would like to systematize the Hebrew Bible would end up in a shortcoming. So his solution was to claim that the only legitimate approach to a theology of the Hebrew Bible, or in the Christian realm to the Old Testament, is a retelling of the Bible. So this was his approach, and I think the big advantage of this approach was that it is non-reductive. He really somehow, in his retelling of the Bible, in his 2-volume of the theology of the Old Testament, he basically grasped everything that was there. Of course, he also had to be selective and elective in what he presented to his readers, but he didn't somehow just identify certain principles in order to present what the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament has to say. And in 1992, there was this also quite voluminous work of Rainer Alberts, professor at the University of Münster at that time in Germany. And he produced and published a big history of religion of ancient Israel. And in the first chapters of his work, he claimed that this history of religion should be the so to speak, the summarizing discipline of Hebrew Bible studies. And I think he was not that far away from Gerhard von Rad. But I think it's really completely clear that Rainer Alberts' approach would not have been possible without what Gerhard Rad did before him. So I think there we can really see a line of dependence within the history of scholarship.
You go on to say that Alberts clearly integrates elements of an enraged approach to his history of Israelite religion. John W. Rogerson, for example, criticizes the headings in Albert's presentation, such as Yahweh, the God of liberation, El and Yahweh as anti-imperial symbols. So what's happening here? What is the Jehu revolution as well?
Yeah, I think this needs to be interpreted within the context of German-speaking Bible scholarship from the 1960s to the 1990s. So enraged might be a typo. So I think it should read engaged. So Alberts was a clear sympathizer of the Social Democrats in Germany. His father even was the mayor of Berlin in the 50s and the 60s of the 20th century. And Alberts tried to find some principles of, this is, of course, not what Rainer Alberts himself said, but those who read him interpreted him in a way that he allegedly tried to find some principles of social democratic thinking behind the Bible. And therefore, these superscriptions like Yahweh, the God of liberation, the anti-imperial symbols, they were suspected to be elements of an engaged approach to the Bible, and not just somehow a historical, philological approach to the Bible, as it was usual in terms of the mood and the fashion that German-speaking Protestant Bible scholarship entertained in the second half of the 20th century.
And in chapter 3, you start talking about the priestly document. You talk about the priestly document using the Hebrew generic term for God in an underlined manner in Genesis 1 and Exodus 6 as a proper name, identifying the genre of God with its only member and thereby propagating an inclusive monotheism. In contrast, he presents himself to the ancestors of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai. Then first to Moses' generation does he disclose his actual name, Yahweh. And as you go on in this chapter, you're talking about Yahweh having different names or different groups in different groups of Israel, but these are just different names of the same God. But in scholarship, there's a lot of scholars that will say that, well, El or Elohim was originally a distinct God from Yahweh. So are they being like, is this happening when they were already combined, or is something else going on here?
Yes, this is a very interesting feature of the Hebrew Bible. I'm talking here about the so-called priestly code, one of the main sources of the Pentateuch, which probably was written in the late Neo-Babylonian period or the early Persian period. So say at the at the end of the 6th century BCE. I think this priestly code, this priestly document, is probably one of the strands in the Hebrew Bible that really deserves to be identified as theological. So I would say it's fair to maintain that the Hebrew Bible mainly includes religious texts, not theological texts. If we define theology as an approach, a critical approach to religion. So in my view, theology relates to religion like anthropology relates to human beings, or botany relates to plants, or zoology to animals. It's the critical reflection of religion. And I think that particularly in its way of speaking of God, we can see how the priestly document within the Pentateuch really tries to develop a theologically reflected notion of God. Of course, the priestly document knows that the biblical God has a name, Yahweh. And this fact that the biblical God has a name already points to the religious history of this God Yahweh. A God only needs a name if there are other gods around. Only then a God really needs a name. And the biblical God, this is a common assumption within biblical scholarship and also within historical scholarship. The biblical God is first tested at some point in the late 2nd millennium. And of course, he first was one deity among others. And now the priestly document, particularly in its beginning, which is the first chapter of the Hebrew Bible, Genesis 1, makes something which is very interesting. It denotes this biblical God as Elohim. And Elohim is nothing else than simply the Hebrew term for the category of gods. And what the priestly code, the priestly document does here is a very influential new shaping of how to speak from God. So of God. So, for example, in English, if we speak of God, we use God like a proper noun, and the same is true for speaking of God in English, in Italian, in Spanish, in French, in German, and in many other languages. And this is basically the result of this monotheistic decision of the priestly code to somehow address and identify the biblical God from the very beginning by the term of the category of gods. But Elohim is always used with verbs in the singular. So Elohim created heaven and earth. So this term without the article and combined with verbs in the singulars is used like a proper noun. Also, proper nouns don't have the article, and nevertheless, they are sufficiently determined. So I think we know that the priestly document really is aware of the biblical name of God, Yahweh. It mentions it in Exodus 6:3, but to its readers, the priestly document introduces God as Elohim. And with this decision, it wants to show there is just one God, and this one God created the world. And because, of course, P knows that this God is also known by its proper name, or his proper name, P develops this theory of a staggered revelation of the biblical God. So for the whole world, God reveals himself as Elohim, as the God per se. And then in Genesis 17, when God still within the priestly document, reveals himself to Abraham. He introduces himself, I am El Shaddai, and Abraham is not just the father of Israel, he is also the father of Ishmael, so also he of the forefathers of the Arabs, and through the son of Isaac, Jacob, he is also the father of the Edomites, because Esau and Jacob, the twin brothers, are closely related. So this revelation as El Shaddai occurs towards an audience that is a bit bigger than Israel, and only in his revelation to Moses in Exodus 6:3, then God really says, this is a very interesting verse, my name is Yahweh, but with this name I did not reveal myself to Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac. They knew him as El Shaddai, and only to the generation of Moses, God reveals himself by his name Yahweh. And the logic within the priestly code is that the name Yahweh is also important for cultic purposes, and therefore this is anchored here in Exodus 6:3.
So the Torah shape of the Psalter, in the course of its literary history, the Psalter underwent various stages of formation. Its present shape is marked by a division into 5 parts. It is probable that the Psalter is seen in analogy to the Torah. So how is it seen as an analogy to the Torah, and how was it determined that it has a 5-part structure established by 4 doxologies?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that most of the psalms within the Psalter probably originated as individual hymns, songs, prayers, and so on. So the Psalter, first of all, is a collection of individual psalms. But on the other hand, we can also clearly see that the book of Psalms was structured as a comprehensive unit. And here on the slide, you can see these instances of these 4 so-called doxologies in Psalm 41:14, 72, 18, and 19, 90, 89, 53, and 106:48. If you look these so-called doxologies, a doxology is simply a praise of God. If you look them up, they are very similar one to another, and they are often followed by an acclamation of the people, or it's said that the people should say Amen, Amen to these doxologies. So we can clearly see that these 4 doxologies structure the Psalter into 5 books that reach from Psalm 1 to 41, from 42 to 72, from 73 to 89, from 90 to 106, and from 107 and 150. So why would someone try to structure the Psalter into 5 books? Why not 4? Why not 7? There would have been several possibilities. And I think it really comes very easily to mind that maybe this 5-fold structure of the Psalter is indebted to making an analogy between the Torah, the 5 books of Moses on the one hand, and the 5 books, so to speak, of David, the Psalms on the other hand. And I think this analogy of the 5 books can also be corroborated simply by looking at the very first psalm, Psalm 1, this very famous psalm, which says that happy be the man who studies the Torah of God day and night. And Psalm 1 does not actually really specify what this Torah of God really is, what is meant by this entity. It doesn't speak of the Torah of Moses, but addresses this object of study as the Torah of Adonai, of Yahweh. And I think it's fair to say that probably this first Psalms wants to say, of course, you can study the Torah of Moses, but you can also study the Torah of David. And there you can also learn about the will of God. So studying the Psalter is also studying the Torah. I think this here we also can see that apparently, again, a theological approach is being entertained towards the Psalter. This individual songs and prayers, they are simply, they are religious texts, but this Torah-like structure within the 5 books of the Psalms is really an interpretive approach to the whole book, to the whole collection of these 150 Psalms.
You go on to say that although the literary substance of Joshua, 2 Kings, and Isaiah, Malachi is, of course, older than the formation of the Torah, in the wake of the Torah's formation, this text complex was evidently reworked and provided with a new orientation. So how was it provided with a new orientation, and how was it determined that this formation was originally older than the Torah before it was reworked?
Yeah, the Torah reaches from Genesis 1 to Deuteronomy 34, and the bulk of the Torah is actually the revelation of God to Moses, the laws that Moses receives from God on Mount Sinai. And at the very end of the Torah, in Deuteronomy 34, verses 10 to 12, we can read that there was no other prophet like Moses after him. Moses was the prophet par excellence, and there were no prophets after him that were like him. So he was really he was a prophet. There were prophets after him, but he was outstanding in a very unique way. Now, if we read on from Deuteronomy 34 into the next chapter that follows at the beginning of the book of Joshua, in Joshua 1, we can see that apparently in Joshua 1, we have an introduction that is not only an introduction to the book of Joshua, but an introduction to the whole part of the Hebrew Bible canon that is called Nevi'im, prophets, and that reaches up to the book of Malachi at the very end of the second part of the Hebrew Bible canon. And at the beginning of Joshua, we can read that God speaks to Joshua and he tells Joshua, be aware of the Torah of Moses and follow it, and this is how you will gain life. And we have a very similar text at the very end of the whole canon part of Nevi'im, of the prophets, at the end of Malachi, in Malachi 3, verses 22 to 24, where there is also a summoning to the readers, be aware of the Torah of Moses. So I think the best explanation for this really huge inclusio that binds the whole textual sequence from Joshua to Malachi together is that apparently here we have also a textual interpretation within the Hebrew Bible that binds Joshua to Malachi together as the second part of the canon, the prophets, the Nevi'im, and subordinates all these books to the Torah of Moses. So whoever reads the Hebrew Bible and stumbles across several sayings that might contradict each other. So these redactors of the Hebrew Bible, they wanted to signal, if you are in such a situation, then please follow what we have in the Torah, because among the prophets, Moses is the one and outstanding prophet, and the other ones, they are important, but they are of lesser significance.
So, which ancient Israelite community do you think promoted Moses the most out of these, out of the rest of them?
Yes, I think that the Torah probably was anchored and transmitted basically at the Second Temple in Jerusalem. These priests that were active there at the temple, they took care of the Holy Scriptures in the Second Temple period, so in basically in Persian, but also in Hellenistic times, and they were a bit anxious about the prophetic tradition in the Hebrew Bible. The prophetic tradition is always something that also can be dangerous, because the prophets, they announce judgment. Some of the prophets even somehow spoke of a new heaven and a new earth, as we can read this in Isaiah 65 and 66. And here the Torah says, no, the creation, heaven and earth, once created, will persist forever. We can see this very well within the Torah. In the Torah, we never have the idea that heaven and earth would not last forever. They are even witnesses for Israel in Deuteronomy 30. So the priests behind the Torah who advocated for Moses as the main arch prophet, so to speak, they were more on a realistic basis, and they wanted to keep the institutions as they were.
What do you think was the oldest source behind the Torah?
Yeah, within the Torah, in the classical model, we have these three strands, J, E, and P, the Yahwist, the Elohist, and P. The priestly document, and traditionally J and E were being dated to the early monarchic period. I don't think that this approach to the Pentateuch is valuable any longer. I think among these three sources, only the P document is really a sound hypothesis, because here you really have links forwards and backwards, so these texts really cohere as a whole, and you also have a very specific language within the P document. Therefore, I would say J and E, these are not sources that go all over the Pentateuch, but what we can see for the earlier stages within the formation of the Pentateuch, that there are specific single stories, laws, for example, also, that might date back to the 9th and 8th centuries. So, for example, the Jacob cycle is probably one of the oldest pieces within the Hebrew Bible. The Exodus story as a written text might go back to Neo-Assyrian times, so maybe the 7th century, although it has oral precursors that might be a bit earlier. And the book of Deuteronomy also probably belongs to the 7th century BCE. This is a long and quite well established theory that the book of Deuteronomy has something to do with the with the reform of King Josiah that is recounted in 2 Kings 22 and 23.
Would you say that after the rise of monotheism in ancient Israel, do you think that there were still holdouts down there that continued to believe in multiple gods even centuries after the rise of monotheism?
Yes, maybe. It's just difficult to say because our main source for Second Temple Judaism is the Hebrew Bible, and the Hebrew Bible is a more or less orthodox document that circulated in the elitist circles of the priests basically in Jerusalem. So we only have a very limited or we have limited sociological insights into what people really believed in the Second Temple period. But if we go to the material, the archaeological evidence, we can really see that there is a significant decrease in the findings of the so-called pillar figurines that often were being identified as representations of the deity, the female deity Asherah. There are, in Persian period times, there are very, very few findings of them. And this might hint to the fact that even in the broader population, somehow monotheism became much more common. But on the other hand, we also have to ascertain that apparently once monotheism was being established in Second Temple Judaism, there were also in the official religion, there were counter movements that somehow tried to refill the heavenly realms with minor heavenly beings like angels and so on. So just to adduce two examples, one could be the book of Job. The book of Job is certainly and clearly a monotheistic document. You just have one God, the God of Israel, who is in charge of everything. But nevertheless, in the book of Job, Satan pops up, and there are the sons of God that are being mentioned within the heavenly council. So I think we can see that apparently the creation, the establishment of monotheism, which took place somewhere in the Babylonian exile, that this lasted probably really just for a very short time. And then the scholars, the religious specialists, but maybe also the people started again to fill up the heavenly realm. A second example besides the book of Job could be the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, we also have a clearly monotheistic position, a monotheistic stance within that book. But in chapters like Daniel 8, 9, or 10, we have also very prominent angels that speak to Daniel. So here again, we can see that monotheism does not simply mean there is just one God, and this is the only and single and sole heavenly being, but there are also minor heavenly agents that then also play a role.
So what kind of sources do you think that actually existed besides P?
Yeah, if we talk of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, then I would say there was something like a proto-Genesis. There was something like the Moses Exodus story, and then there was the book of, or the legal corpus of Deuteronomy. And the proto-Genesis was something that was composed out of the primeval history, which might have existed once as a literary entity unto itself. Then the patriarchal stories, the ancestors' story around Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the Joseph novella. So these were entities unto themselves, but they were not, as the traditional model assumed from the very beginning, already put into a sequence. Then the Moses Exodus story, which starts in Exodus and covers also parts of Leviticus, Numbers, and might originally even have included something like this, a story of conquest that we now have in the book of Joshua. This would be a second element besides P. And it has long been seen that the book of Deuteronomy also is something, an entity unto itself, which probably existed as a text that was not yet integrated into a larger source.
When do you think that the Torah was completely and fully integrated? By which century?
Yeah, I think here I can also rely on a specific or on a quite a broad consensus within biblical scholarship. I think that the Torah was brought into its final shape by the end of the 4th century BCE. So around 330, 320 BC. I think it's three arguments that can be brought up here. So first, we have the book of Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah that belong to that period, and they speak of the Torah in the singular, and it's not completely clear whether they really already have the final Torah in mind or in view when they mention the Torah, but I think it's clearly a literary entity onto its way as we already have it then, or as we have it then in its final shape. So Chronicles around also the end of the 4th century seems to presuppose an identifiable Torah. The second argument that also points into that direction is that we know that the Torah was being translated into Greek around 250 BCE in Alexandria. The Jews of Hellenistic Egypt, they were no longer, or a majority of them was no longer able to read and to understand Hebrew, so it became necessary to translate the Holy Scriptures into Greek. And the Torah was the first block of scriptures that were being translated into Greek. And we can, from several factors, we can estimate that this took place around 250 BCE. And we know that the Greek Pentateuch, the Greek Torah, presupposes a finished Torah, so the Torah must have been finished before 250 BC, which also points at a date around 300, maybe a little earlier. And the third argument is the theological shape of the Torah. The Torah doesn't seem to presuppose the historical events of the downfall of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire lasted from 539 to 333, 331 BCE, and the Persian Empire in the ancient world was being seen as a very peaceful, stable period of political peace, and within that period, actually, no one thought that there would be major events that would overthrow this peaceful world order. So to somehow take up a concept by the philosopher Francis Fukuyama, who used this in a completely different way. I think that, some Jews in the Second Temple period in Persian time thought this is the end of history. But then with the turmoils and the military actions of Alexander the Great, this became completely different. So this peaceful Persian world order was being overthrown in the years between 330 and 300 BCE. And in that time, probably some prophecies were written down that expected cosmic judgment. And as I mentioned this beforehand, within the Torah, we don't have any hints that the authors and the redactors of the Torah ever thought or ever came to the idea that heaven and earth would not persist forever. Because the cosmos is so stable, or seems so stable within the Pentateuch, we actually can assume that the Torah does not presuppose the events of Alexander the Great, who overthrew the Persians at the end of the 4th century. So all these three factors, Chronicles, Septuagint, the Greek translation, and this idea of a stable cosmos, they all point to a date of the Torah at the end of the 4th century BC.
Do you think this could have had anything to do with Ezra and his efforts with one of the Persian kings? Because there's a story of him bringing in a Torah.
Yes, this is a very common idea that Ezra somehow composed the Torah. We simply do not have clear information about this in the Bible. What we can read in Ezra chapter 7 is that Ezra was being commissioned by the Persian king to bring the law of the God and the law of the king to Israel. And this might reflect a very specific institution within the Persian Empire, that the Persian Empire didn't know an overarching imperial law, but the Persians had a much more diversified solution of having their subdued people following a law. They required them to choose themselves and to present the legal corpus according to which they wanted to live to the Persian administration. And this might point to the fact that the Jews selected Torah in order to live according to it, and that by living according to the Torah, they also lived in a certain sense according to the law of the king. And this might explain this strange double expression, the law of the God and the law of the king, because it's not really imaginable how these could be two different entities. It rather seems that it's one and the same law, the Torah, that could be addressed as the law of God, the law of your God, if from the perspective of the Persian king, and the law of the king from the perspective of the Persian king, whereas the law of God would be the Israelite or the Judean view towards this thing. But probably I assume we cannot say much more than that the Torah was being brought together, was redacted at some point at the end of the 4th century BCE at the Temple of Jerusalem.
Final question. Why do you think that by the end of the first millennium BCE, that or close to that the Torah was attributed to Moses? Why do you think that happened?
Yeah, this is a difficult question. I think that within the biblical period, during the first millennium BCE, there was already an attribution to Moses. Of course, the Torah is the Torah of Moses, but this was not understood as an attribution in terms of authorship. I think this is something that already the rabbis saw, and is also very clear from the text of the Torah itself. The Torah cannot have been written completely by Moses, because in the last 7 verses of the Torah in Deuteronomy 34, we can read about the death and the burial of Moses. And of course, Moses was a great man, but he could not have written about his own death and burial. And therefore, already in the Babylonian Talmud, the 7 last verses are being attributed to Joshua instead of Moses. But I think also in general, the Torah, according to the usage in the ancient Near Eastern scribal circles, the Torah was simply an anonymous textual bodies. It's a very modern notion to always ask, who wrote this? Who is the author of these texts? The texts in the ancient Near East were not authorial literature, they were much more tradition literature. So it was important that the tradition was being respected, and whoever wrote it down was not so important. And therefore also in the Psalms, if it says this Psalm is from David, here the Hebrew preposition le is being used. This does not necessarily mean that these texts thought that David was the author of these Psalms, but that these Psalms somehow belong to the realm of David. And so the Torah also belonged to the realm of Moses. And then I would say at the end of the first millennium, the beginning then of the first millennium CE, we have this idea that all the texts of the Bible are revealed. They are revelation literature. And therefore, a specific persona was being needed to which this textual Buddha body could be attributed. And in the case of the Torah, because the Torah was so closely connected to the person of Moses, he became the author of the Torah.
Well, thanks for joining me once again, Dr. Konrad Schmid. And I thank everybody else for participating in the live chat. And I will see all of you later. Thanks again, Doctor.
Thank you for having me again. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Yep. Bye-bye.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.